the shoulder, the upper arm, and the shoulder. So let's say someone touches me there. So depending on who touches me, there's a different reaction. So if it's a person who I do not like, I may, and without this person hurting me, they just merely touch me. So in that moment, I may get angry. If the person who touches me is dirty, is someone who's not clean, is like a dirty person, then I may feel disgusted. I may feel nauseous upon them touching me. Or if it's someone towards I have attachment or desire, then there's a feeling of happiness. So but actually in actuality, all there is that he touches and I am touched. So he touches and I am touched. That's all there is. So that's what really appears to the mind. And if I go into a detailed examination of what actually happened, well, what was touched in the case of my shoulder or my upper arm being touched? Neither my heart, not my blood, nor my lung, my belly, my legs, etc. None of those were touched. Only my shoulder, and in this case only a small part of the shoulder. And not the inside, just the outside of the shoulder. And then on the outside, it's just the skin. And in the different skin layers, there's the outer skin layer and there's the inner skin layer. It's the outer skin. And in reality, it's only very few places very few places of the outer skin that are actually touched. And likewise, with regard to the person who's touching me, well, when I say he has touched me, so in this case, the only thing is not his mind, it is not any other part of the body, other than, I say, his hand. But then of the hand, we talk about the palm of the hand, we talk about the fingers. It is actually just the four fingers. Four fingers have touched me, not the thumb, but the other four fingers. They have touched me. And it's not the inside of those fingers, but it's the outside of those fingers that have actually touched me in that moment. If I leave aside just the feeling that has this movement, this touching has invoked in me, if I really leave that, if I were to just leave that aside, what has really happened? Two different people's skin have touched. But if the person who is not clean, who I perceive as dirty, touches me, even if their hand is clean, their hand may be totally clean, their body is dirty, their body hasn't touched me, their hands have touched me, the clean fingers have touched me, and still I feel disgusted. If it's a person I do not like, I react with anger, and if it's a person I have desire towards, I react with being pleased, being happy about these.
其实到底人生的了，我是一个在一起对，爸爸的嘛，因为爸爸的了短信呗，俺我是一起，我不去在一起，多民度，他有了的。
So therefore, when I'm being touched, the place that is being touched, is there any kind of substance that I can call the I that can be found there that is also touched? Is there a kind of self, a kind of I, a kind of substance, a kind of nature or entity that is also being touched that I can call the I?
他组织几个地区呢？这个话，这个话他组织那为了组织能成长弄小人的，这样，那看到那人生的可以组个在的人，所以的那个在的话他。 但这个人生的人那个在的嘛，因为在现在就对。
So someone taking their finger and then touching my nose and stubbing my nose out of anger, if they kind of stub my nose or pinch my nose with their finger and stub my nose, is there actually an I that is being stuck in that moment? Is there a separate substance or separate entity that is stuck upon this person kind of stubbing my nose?
在我背指的那个部分，除了我鼻尖的这块皮之外，还有你在这块皮之外，可以称之为我的指腹的那边。
在现在就有呢，俺做几个的，他切个小当不着，切个的那屋里人，切个的他在现在他我是在的人，的老那样做的车上嘛人跟车主挺有的，是吧？俺在的那星期我的人，俺可惜他那米奇的人送是，咔罗大的。 米奇的人送，俺我的人送，俺马刚人家那车的人送，刚人的他那年的人送，他第二对象呢，俺天天在面的米生在一起，马生在一起，年生在一起， 레다 저거지도 그 내가 뭐 못해요. 제 미장 뭐 시고치도 레고 지그러다. 디지디다 수국이 그 나로기 둘진 곳에 잡으래. 같이 자르래. 같이 니르래. 같이 밀르래. 같이 나르래. 근데 곳에 잡도 그래.
So if, let's say, you touch something, so another person touches your nose, touches your nose, well, if the part of that finger that touches the nose, if that also touches the person next to also the nose, then you have to divide the particles that touch the nose, because half of the particles touch the nose and half touch the person. Because you still have something, you need to have something that is also touched. So therefore, we have to kind of go and divide them up. And if, let's say, another person's nose is being touched, so a third person touches another person's nose. So if that happens, if that other person, from one perspective, that person is an enemy, from another perspective, that person is someone that is liked, so a friend, an enemy. So in that moment, all these people are being touched. In actuality, one nose is being touched, but we say my enemy was touched, or my friend was touched, or someone I don't know was touched. So different people actually are being touched here. So if they really exist as separate, then we need to divide that into the particles that actually touch the nose into different parts, because otherwise there's no particle left that touches all these different individuals. So besides the nose, the enemy is touched, the friend is touched, the stranger is touched, all these different people that from the point of view, from a certain perspective, are stranger, enemy, and friend.
之外还有一个是指而是我的话呢，那就会那是要用这种方法来去区分。
지선도 기시메나 마시에 로가지메나 다 나를 레고를 때는 나를 레송스는 심기 찬원자마도 주구주가 주는 렉세들은 나 메타주로다. 그래서는 대단히 제 로가민도 신달을 레투고 말아 들리죠.
So if there's nothing there, then I can say that it's just an appearance. So there is no separate substance separate than what's actually touched. And so it's just an appearance. It's just a mere appearance, the mere appearance of the eye. There's no separate kind of substance or substance, and a separate entity that I call the self, or that I call the eye.
能够被指我的地方，在指的地方哪里就只有鼻尖而已，没有鼻尖这个地方，其他地方其实没有被指。 那如果这个地方上面没有我的话呢，那你就只能够说是一语指着鼻子而说指着我。
얘네들 놀러 차리기도 말레렉스스 대레네 말레렉스 대레네 말레렉스 대레네 말레렉스 렉세디에 나 미자 뭐지 여번이 차리기입니다. 마세 뭐부치지 뭐부치들라 아니 딜레렉스 말레렉스 그게 말레렉스 그게 말레렉스 근데 렉세 찍도했다. 얘네들인디다 찍대래로 찍대래로 군선이 주주서 뭐부 찍도해 여러분.
So then it's actually just an appearance to the mind. So then Geshe touched himself on his right cheek, on his left cheek. So when he touched himself on his right cheek, he was saying, so is there a self that's being touched? And when he touched himself on his left cheek, is there something that's being touched? And then when he touched himself on his lower arm, on the right lower arm, on the left lower arm, then he touched himself again on his cheeks and on his knee. So every time he's saying, so when I touch myself there on his left shoulder and right shoulder, is there every time a self, an entity that's being touched? Are there all these different selves that are being touched in that moment? And what are those different entities then?
제산다 전환기 통에 딘디 연구열에 배나 갈라오래. 이만테 다름살을 자가르치다 배워지 잠지셔로 잠지셔로 아니 가르치나 자가들라 가지 동이나 직체니 디사인들라 자가르신다든지 콜레 동는데 되기도 거기 쟁으로 하다. 배워신다도 배우기 제레스. 되기도 다 배워놓는다. 야 자가르기 제레스. 야 자가르신다 싶은 그러. 그래서 다 삼류기 키초디 배우기 제레. 레디 다 코베바레스 또 코베바레스 또 자가르기 제레스디 아니 콜 디마도 오늘 지나 당부 추 동년디다 안파 동사디 카가라 베디거라 굉장히 가래 자가르지를 동시하스려 다 배워지 파 동가 조사도 코로나는 동가 먼저 하지 미신다지도 동거다 또 주구주가 좀 배트 카가로 미 단다 동서디 깨꾸지 제며 거기 레디는 천난기 배바 신직다 배바 취진이란다 먼저 친구들은 이제는 지그리 다데리라는 지그리 나오러다 가지 어느 배배 동송 뒤로 다 뒤서로 붙이기 오늘지나 단다디 애를 링인다 연을 링이니디 주구주가 좀 릭사 배트 카가로 다 샘레 나오네 아니 파기직 수혜지 안 맞을 릭송스 와시 뭐부지킨 거기에 맞을 릭송 거기에 맞을 릭송스 지난 뒤지도 전에 대기디 단다 배바다 자가기 점지자리에 기재디 눈진이 뭐든 가지 어디서 하고 두고도 그래서 수신인들 그게 맞지 미신다를 지르세요 하고 두고도 다 뒤에는 안 찍어 자기도 아니 수파게 미치기 아니 무조시바 있는 고방 아니 슝인들 나와라 파 동자 강벌을 쉬고 그 강백게 제명 언제게 제명 디니디 찍고 지야 돼도 다 뒤를 먼저 세워하고 오면도 미점지 제들라 가시 따뜻 렘다 사고도 저기 제시하면도 렘다 사고만 힘이 저기 뒤랑다 눈주리 했었네 하고 두고도 오늘 전에 찍고 지야 돼도 디니
So, from the point of view of feeling, from the point of view of one's feeling, this is how it appears. And before, previously, Dharamsala, there was a time when there was a problem between a Tibetan and an Indian. So they had some conflict between them, and Gishla said, I'm not sure what happened, but it seems that the Tibetan was beaten up the Indian. And in response to that beating, then the Indian beat up another Tibetan. And then in response to that, the next day, the Indian beat up the next Tibetan, again someone else. So if you think about it, it's a totally different Tibetan that was beaten up. So actually the conflict was between these two people, but when taking revenge, it was not the original person that beat up the Indian that was beaten up, but a different Indian. And likewise, the Tibetans reacted by beating up, again, another Indian, a totally different person. So there is a sense that there's therefore some real Tibetanness, like a real Tibetan over there, some different, like an overarching kind of person. So in the sense that therefore if I hit, so it was a Tibetan beat me up, therefore I have to beat up a Tibetan. That kind of logic, as if there was some kind of separate entity. So just by reason of the fact that the person who beat me up was a Tibetan, therefore I beat up a Tibetan. The person who beat up a Tibetan was an Indian, therefore I beat up an Indian. So really here, when we talk about philosophy, when we talk about debate, we say the subject, the person, the Tibetan is just one. Is it one or is it different? So it's one, a Tibetan. But really when we look at it, it's just an appearance to the mind. A Tibetan is just something constructed by the mind. Likewise, when I say left side of my shoulder, when I touch the rest of the part of the left side of my shoulder, when I touch the right side of my shoulder. So in that case, really I touch the right side, I touch the left side, but I think in both cases, my mind fabricates, my mind constructs, takes to mind an a different entity. So actually in the case of the Tibetan and the Indian, you know this doesn't make sense, this is actually a mistake. But think of another situation. If someone takes their fist and they hit you with their fist on your forehead, so what hit you was their fist, but in response to that, you kick his leg. Actually, it doesn't make sense. What hit you was the fist, it was not the leg. So why would you kick him? Why would you kick his leg if actually what hit him was the fist? It's again this idea that there's a separate entity, there's something separate there, and so therefore you're actually hitting the person, so it doesn't seem to matter what you hit. So in the first case, with the Indian and the Tibetan fighting, and then in response to one Tibetan beating up a person, you beat up another Tibetan, you know this is a mistake. We're aware of this not making sense. But what about the second case?
다디지 뒤전에 제상 아니 주구주가 전화 빠빠디모도 매딩이 이네 료이 따 데라 때네 아니 말아제 송스 따 다디는 신 다디 데스 찰레라요 닥시디 지금도 요마로 뉴뉴지모도 요마로 다디는 신 유지고 지경 다 가르스 그래 아니 크게 두자 나송스 크게 두자 나송스 라디자네 다 조조가 전에 당보 가르다 크게 그 공로지사 안 두자 나고지테 다디셰버 안디 템버 디왕기 아니 파게 디 템버 디 다체다 안 로아디기 니 푸죠 로아디 아니 푸디 디 파이프디네야테 안 다이 디기 아니 디 미바카두기 디 레디 아니 케차로 디 미바카두 치도아 케데 아니 케디 라바자미나다 마수 두샤다스 나마로 아 디체다 젤레체 소체 추도체 디즈기 구조자 링구당바다 지거래다 간제 그와 다 링구도 스당바다 지거래다 다 민자와디 가르스는 주구유에 셀디 추도다 젤레 유샤로 디체 아니 신네 아니 가산다와네 큐 키는 신 리샤 세치 책도샤 딘지 되는 거로 다 딜라디 다 주구주가 주는 대점래도 당고 디칭인디 셰버들의 파게 전대교 군용 공조들의 디젤란 로아게라 제레 아니 우들의 아니 추도들의 소들의 디게들다 대점마다 다 딜레 로스 크레 랍송생 코디 가와여 간지시도 크레 간지슬라.
So, therefore, what we actually can point at, the actual thing to point at, so in the case of touching, for example, the shoulders, is one specific thing. So it's the entity of the self, that is fabricated, that is imputed by the mind. So, therefore, it's the mind that constructs the mind, perceives, therefore, a separate self. Now, that is actually relatively easy to understand that, because the basis of imputation on the basis of which we impute self, in this case, the right or the left side of the shoulder, is just one. There's just one basis of imputation, either the right side or the left side. But it becomes more complicated when there are more different bases of imputation. For instance, when someone abuses us verbally, so they say something negative to us. Let's see what is the basis of imputation of us imputing bad person on that other person. So, what it is first of all, the basis of imputation for us imputing this person as being a bad person, there's anger that arises in this continuum. Out of anger then gives rise to the motivation to say something negative. And then the person takes a deep breath, fills the lungs with air, and then due to the air together with the rest of the air kind of is left goes out to the vocal cord. The vocal cord is being activated. And so if you were just to say "oh," then that's be alright. That's not seen as abusive. But what more happens is that the upper palate, the tongue, the lips, they all work together to form the words "you are like a dog," "you're just like a dog." It's like playing flute, actually. When you play a flute. When you play a flute, except here you use the upper palate and the tongue, etc. So that's the difference. But other than that, it's just this coming together of those parts, and the result is saying "you're like a dog." So really, they're just different parts that gave rise to these abusive words. It was the anger, it was the motivation, it was the breath, it was the lung, it was all the parts of the mouth. That's what gave rise to the abuse. So that's the basis of imputation.
다 디게디 자외 용주의 자외긴 다 셰바군의 공조선에면도 전대기 군용 셰바스에 대해 셰바선 도도직미도 셰바를 민자고 뭐 유비 나오는 지게 뒤에 든지 규단기는 되는 기비다 무부직 차대고 딜라디다 파게 데브르보터 위나 다 비트리기 체디 차주고 다 셰바데로 와파게 그 로그 체디 간제 다 데브르보를 라바데 찍어내면 돼 미기라이데 시직디 시작이 데브르보지 찍디 하게 자기 제대로 그렇지. 다 개발돼 가려서는 언제서 크게 라우슨 다지 하게 감사지 라바 주민 감사지 셈을 샤야 되게 롱랑 제대로 그럴 때는 롱랑입니다. 또 뭐시 하모고는 롱랑이라 제대로 다샤네 나서네 제대로 다네 셈기 다 크게 라우슨 되나 롱랑이로. 그래서 롱랑만 나되는 시 준비이 되리마도 신직벌에도
So here, in the case of the person who has said something abusive, the person who gets angry towards, actually, of of course, on a mental basis, there's the anger, there's the motivation, and so forth. But if you look at it, it's not just one mind, it's not just one awareness. It's a type of anger that gives rise to the mind that wants to say something. So different awarenesses here are at play that then are responsible for saying something. And again, those awarenesses, they have their own causes and conditions, which then give rise to their arisal. So it's like a lot of kind of different awarenesses that are now responsible for someone saying something. So, but nonetheless, I get angry, I fabricate this kind of negative person there. If on the other hand there's a tape recorder which says the same words, so out of the tape recorder when it is played, it plays the words, "You're just like a dog." So here the battery is like the mind. The battery of this tape recorder is like the mind. But I don't get angry with the tape recorder. So if on one side there's an actual person saying you're like a dog, and on the other side there's a tape recorder, in one case I'm saying, oh, this is a bad person, I get angry. Whereas I don't get angry with the tape recorder on the other hand, on the other side. But it's actually the same. It's just different causes and conditions, different objects that give rise to the sound, you're just like a dog, to those words. But on one hand, I impute this kind of person something negative there. Of course, with regard to the tape recorder, if I think it was an actual person, I may actually get angry until I find out these were the words that came from the tape recorder.
따디나시 미기 통화를 때네 닝게 통 나외 퇴발 때네 게 라베 자와 제발 때네 게 제스 어진 차시르레 라 때네 따버레스 상황.
So likewise, when my eye sees something, I then say I see. When my nose smells something, I say I smell. When my mouth tastes something, I say I taste something. When my ears hear something, I say I hear something. So it's just certain cases on the basis of which I then fabricate I.
따디 차시르 때네 따버 빼나 다기 지고 룰레레 볼 때네 말레 송스 셈나 마지 볼 때네 마지고 민두스 따따버 지고 자고라.
So it's really just on the basis of parts that I impute self. So I impute on the basis of my shoulder, which is just a part, I impute I. Then there's a mind that doesn't feel happy, that has an unpleasant kind of experience, and they say I'm unhappy because the mind is unhappy. So these are just parts.
땅에 함모에지 또 따당디 함모에지 긴저질라다 미지기 투데베산페 두자르샤스 띵아 고르다 딱 코말로 두자르게 두스 간데스 라레 투데베상 치 민기지시는 투데베산 랭에 뭐 보여로 아니 코말 라수세데 간데스 라다 수불은 개체요 말에 아니 달람나 아니 퀘셈나 마차르레스 디마도시 김세민다 거기 투데베산 두자레 레드 퀘셈데 나로는 마차르데요레스 투데베산 신 납사 신다도즈 차려 말레스 딘디지 람나마도 신말을 두자 납송 세기 따서디 하고 난 콜레 차르레스 김세디는 나와디니 퀘셈이 모리와리마도 네데 게요마로 딜리디 말을 납송 세기 간데스 라브 근데 주제 기제 많이 거지 직주부 된디나다 그도 아무데서 해도 되는다 암주 심부스도 디테스도 그 깨침부터디 암주디 대직치기도 디지디 맞지버지 써요 디만 임버지 잡로는 파게 식 라이어라 가자 미식 렌테지 되는데서 두자도 라기도스 나도 말 간스타 다시를 때 다시 가를 때 따이도 하고 하면도
there is another situation where I don't really know how to answer this, so maybe you can help me. So if someone says Geshe Tugden Pesach is not a good person, if someone were to say that, so Geshe Tugden Pesach is not a good person. So in that case, when he said Geshe Tugden Pesach, well, there are many people who call Geshe Tugden Pesach. There are other people who have the same name. And so really it's not, when he says those words to me, it's not really my body he's saying, or it's not my mind or anything. It's really just to his own mind, there is a Geshe Chugyam has an appearance. So it's even if it's directed towards me in this case. So it's just another person appearing, like from the side of the past, from his own mind. What appears, it's me. I appear to this, but it's just the appearance of me to that person. So how can I actually say he says it to me if what he directs it towards is actually just the appearance of me to his own mind? So I'm not talking about what is being said here. So if someone says very loudly, you're a jerk, if someone kind of accuses me, then it may kind of injure my ears, just because it's so loud, for example. No, it's not from that perspective here. It's just actually saying, like quietly, like, someone gets a message or something, and then I hear that someone says, Geshe Chugyam is a jerk, or Geshe Chugyam is not a good person. So then, in this case, what is it actually that he's directing that kind of Geshe Chugyam? What is he actually directing it at? It's not really me.
这样子，我觉得他说我坏话好像还有一道理。如果是别人传话说某人说图片非常的坏话，这个时候我到底是怎么产生出他说我坏话的这种想法？那个时候的我不定是到底是什么？
这真的是的，可是我的，如果的，可以拆卸的那个人，的拆卸的人。
You also say that the notepad is the part of the iPad?
现在便利贴我们会说是 iPad 的。
Is the notebook, is that a part of
这些嘛，是吧？
Why
不
not?
会说，可是为什么我们不会说？
Why is it not part? Why is the notepad not a part of the iPad?
선생님 로가래, 카가래.
They're separate. They're different.
로가지, 카가 있나? 차시를 입니다.
If something is separate or if something is separate has a different entity, then it cannot be the part. One cannot be the part of the other.
입니다. 그래서 나 디제디 전에 아니 디 쪽지세디 디리 로가 있나? 디제 야당하고 디리 로스주에나 야당하디 조지 차시를 입말.
So likewise, if the table were to exist as a separate entity from its parts, then we couldn't say that the parts of the table are the parts of the table because they're totally separate.
디 야나다 나도와 강들 줍시지체 아니 강방아지 디기디 쪽지기 차시래 말이.
So are these five parts the parts of the table?
这里有四只桌脚跟一个桌板，请问这四
And
只
those
桌
five
脚跟
things,
桌
the
板是
surface
什
and
么
the
桌
four
子？
legs, are they parts of the table?
这是一차시래 와.
是吧？是。可是这五元素是桌子的支分。
그래서 쪽지세디 야나 디리 로가 있나? 그 차시래 세디 딩마 송하스.
So therefore, if the table were to exist, hypothetically, if it were to exist as separate from its parts, we couldn't say that those parts are the parts of the table because it's totally separate from those parts. So there's no reason to hold the parts of the table.
그래서 나세디 수부등 셈디리 로스유에나 다 수부등 셈디 너기 차시 말어. 리미도.
So likewise, if the self of the eye was separate from the mind and body, then I couldn't say that the mind and body are parts of the self, are parts of the eye.
그래서 치료백에 참여 시골 따바 지부 랑와서 지부세디 참여 기지 시골 저는 다세디 차시명이 기지 시골 단 남백이다 수보다 셈디 다기 차시레스 기지 시골과 강들 그 가를 이내면은 간지 로가지 있나 콜 뭐 타데도 유나 그 차시레스 나도입니다.
So the non-Buddhists, they actually say, the non-Buddhists say, when they talk about a self, they say the self is permanent, the self is partless, and the self exists as an independent entity. So they say the self is unique or partless, it doesn't have parts. But from a point of view, a Buddhist point of view, that is not asserted. From a Buddhist point of view, the self has parts. It is not partless. It has parts because it has a mind and a body and so forth. So therefore, it's not possible to posit a self that exists as being a separate entity or of a different nature than the aggregates, than its parts.
그래서 딱 어디 풍불이 로스 유에나 어디 참여 자주도.
So if the self really existed as separate from the mind and body aggregate, then it would have to be partners. The self would have to be the I, would have to be partners.
제가 딜을 내가지. 야나 풍물이 로스 유엔에 참에 리그마리 레긴데 야나 참에 레레기.
So how do you answer this? Does the body, does the self exist as separate from the aggregates but has parts, or does it exist separate and as partners?
갈레기.
What are you saying? What do you think?
참에로. 제가 나 참에 이제. 나 참에 임번은 신지부지기야 전에 다 조지 참에 차도로와. 조지세디 딜 로스로와. 나디 로스 요나 조지디 딜 로스 요리 요말. 자신과 딜 로스 요리 요말.
So if the answer here from someone was that the self is partners, well then Geshe-la said, well take the table therefore. If the self exists separate, the table has to exist separate. So if it is separate from its parts, it also has to be partners.
조지디 자신디 로스 요리 요말.
Does the table exist as separate from its parts or not?
요말이스. 나디 로스 요리스.
But the self does exist. The self exists as separate from the mind.
我呢是另外而有，在运体之外有的。
다디 중생시에다가 조지디 자신디 로스 메비 중생다.
Give me a reason why. Give me a reason for why the self exists as separate from the mind.
야나메나네 나디 로스 유비 중생카르 지부지냐다.
So why do I exist separate? What is the reason?
其实题目是一样的，虽然问的方向好像不一样。講零叫我屬於，零叫我屬，零叫我
Should
當
we change your answer?
我等意思呢？
哪一个？你换成哪一个比较快？变没有。
It doesn't exist.
什麼願望？哦，我哋老鼠加油嘛。
There's no separate self from there.
제가
在域外是没有。
어떻게 라고야디 중생치고래도 데리로스메데 네 둘이 둘이 조지를 두고도 라바이나 라바를 레디오나를 해서 치바로 로스 요래 아니 얘기 수고 얘기 셈다기도 하잖아 아니 조지기 강바 조지기 답안에 라기로 치바래기도 다디 rin제 땅저도 아니 다디 로스 요래 참여를 라바이나 디리버 마땅한데 수고디 참여 차로 수고 지용데 디나지 조지디 참여 차로 조지 참여 차와 있느냐 딜레 고셔제기로 고셔제는 기지시온데 뒤에 참여를 딜레도 다 뭐부터 탐지 참여 차로 마 충분히 따는데
Now, therefore, there cannot be a separate self. There cannot be a self that exists separate from the aggregates, because if there were to be a separate self, it could only be partless. Likewise, that is true when we apply this to the table. With respect to the table, like before, I said because I hold the leg of the table, therefore I hold the table. So there must be that one is the part of the other, because otherwise I couldn't say so. If they were really separate, then also the self, okay, so the self, if it were to exist separately, it has to be partless, but then the parts of that self, such as the body, that would also have to be partless, because again, it would exist separate from what we call its parts. And then each part, again, since it is made of other parts, again, each part must be partless. So in the end, I have to say that everything is partless. There's nothing that has parts because everything exists separate from that which makes up the phenomenon.
참여차는 그냥 가려.
What is the problem if you accept partless phenomena? What is the problem with that?
디시디다 참여 가용되잖아요. 당무수 수매도 둘생강을 해. 아바디즈다 참여 인랑이 시다요 말어. 다 둘생 참여 샤와이나 그냥 가려를 스페셜나 파이게다 센즈미 슝나는 뭐 가제다 땡큐르드즈는 올라 가리송이었으나 안 둘젠디 참여이나 아니 딩나 보고 말했어. 니만도 시작이로 와. 니만디 아니 크리차 탐제를 보러. 안 딜란 딩나 리그 말았어. 차 딩나 리디 차지를 포 차지들 마포 니마마 포와 인장 아니 그 딩나시 기지디 리거를 마도 니마 디네포나 딩나 용 말어. 딩나 리그 말했어.
So here when we talk about partless particles, why phenomena cannot be partless. So this is being refuted in the scriptures, in particular in the scriptures on the Chittamatra system, in the treatises, there are reasons given for why phenomena cannot be partless. In particular, like partless particles, they're being refuted. And so one of the reasonings that is given is when you have the sun shine onto a particle, if that particle doesn't have parts, then it has to shine on those parts equally. So you couldn't have a shadow, you couldn't have a part that's in the shade, because it's partless. So therefore there's not a part on which the sun shines and a part on which it doesn't shine. So there wouldn't be a shadow, you couldn't have a shadow. This particle could not throw a shadow, because such a shadow would mean there's a part.
아니 뭐 디기 차 탐진이 비자잖아. 비자잖아. 파스 집어지게 비자잖아. 줘요 말아 파스. 제가 그 비자집도 저거도. 저도 그 차직을 슈테 차직들 슈마테와 인상 비자진이 파트래요. 제가 비자제면은 뭐 참 구조제요 말을 정자들.
Another reason is if you have a phenomenon, so if the parts, the left and the right side, are not different, then when you push the right side, you likewise also push the left side. So then the phenomenon cannot move. It cannot move because you push something from the left and the right at the same time. There's no movement. But the fact we can actually push something is because we push it on one side and the other side is not being pushed. So therefore the phenomenon, when it's just pushed on the right side, it can move towards the left because the left side does not receive the same equal kind of push.
那所谓移动这个结果是怎么产生的？是因为有一面被推动，另外一面没有被推动，所以移动这个动作才会发生。因此，如果今天是无方分的话，那应该怎么样都不会动。
그래서 답하게 레기용도 있잖아요. 디네 차직레, 디네 차직레도 링루친으로 도시도. 계시 차탐진의 레기로나 아니 니숨 가져잖아요. 링루 두고 말로. 차탐진의 레기로나 대도가나 신차로. 숨쉬가 뭐고 가지 자샤바 있네. 링루단 치료 두고 말로. 그래서 그 도시도 치료 줘야 돼. 차직디 대체 차직디 파절이야 인자. 양주되는 뭐지 내주도 야 차직디 대지도 링링 두고. 그래서 뭐보다 치료 줘야 돼. 그게 둘ချင်း좀용도 있잖아요. 치료 줘 투해야 돼. 차직디 말이 차직디 파절이 차직디 주절이 뭐 도ချင်း차시 유해야 돼. 치료 줘라마도 차 탐진의 레그로나 둘친디기 치료 두고 말했어.
So likewise, Geshe showed this iPad and this notepad, and said when I put those two together, since they have parts, I can get a bigger object. If I attach a smaller object to a bigger object, I can get a bigger object. Why? Because they have parts. If there were no part, the object would merge into one. So this is the idea that when I have many small parts, if I bring these particles together, these small objects together, I can actually have a bigger object. Why? Because the part that touches one part of the object does not touch the other part of the object. Another part can be added to another side. So different sides are touched by different phenomena, and so therefore an object can grow. If there were no parts, then whatever touches one side touches the other side, touches the upper and the lower side, etc. And the object would just merge into one, and it would never get bigger. So the fact that small things, when they come together, they can form a bigger phenomenon is only possible because phenomena.
초진의 차시 매 나보다 캡세디 난게 차두고도스 차시 매는 캡이에요 말했어.
So therefore saying that something doesn't have parts and something expands is contradictory. So it's a contradictory to say that something expands or that something pervades something if it doesn't have parts. If it pervades space, it cannot pervade space if it doesn't have parts.
딜레디다 와디 차시 명이나 안 지중의 강til보다 캡세 계제도 용마로 딜레디 와 유세디 미숙한이 직시하고 지기로 디바질이 대예스 디시가 저나 간데슬라고 단다 가서 힌두 출신 가시지 디 니마 딘디 시가 가서 다디 레베나로 요레스 단다 아무도 신경 못 돼. 이마에 껍질라 레바기 자와징이 떼와직 요래 생각이 섬수 중매로 그러와 중을 제 아니다 치수이나 떼와직 민도스 유서로 자와징이 떼와선 직 민도스 레바 참아 파수 편집 되는 내가 제가마도 자와징이 자와징 떼와디 딜세 레바지 민도스 얘들이 거대 가정님은 떼와지 유배에서도 섬수 생집이 시디 어디기 되는 자네다 다 따과디 레벨은 요르스 어디 가도 될 요르스 dinner 나게들이 요구다 지난 이내 용화던 계기로 가장 나만나시 다닝능의 요반 이나 로하기 예의 요구로 예의 요구로 디나시 다디능의 레벨은 되나 무수시부터 오로 서부시우시 기를 요르 지금 용화던 계기로 맞서 간질러를 차대에 다디 대요마로 아버지 대여가 있나 아니 감사라는 가사라는 것이 계제도 정말 감발 투디 말을 해서서 계제도 용해요 말에 제가 단내 제라버질라 요레슨 주 용화다의 기기를 주제시도 델레요로
So therefore, if we say that the self is partners, we cannot say that the self pervades the entire body, saying if someone touches me here, I'm touched. If he touches me here, I'm touched. So touching different parts of the body, this is all kind of saying to be I, so to be pervasive in that sense. But Geshe-la says that at some point, their Hindu teacher gave a teaching, and he said that the self, since they accept partner self, that self exists in the brain. He pointed actually at a specific point in the brain where that partner self resides. And Geshe-la has heard that neurologists or neuroscience, when they initially started investigating the brain, there was a sense that there's some kind of control center. There must be some kind of central part of the brain that controls everything else. And then Geshe-la heard that later on that idea was discarded as scientists found out there is no such control center, but that each part of the brain just cooperates with one another. So there's this kind of idea, so there's this idea, if there were a control center, if there was some kind of center, well, if there was a partless self, that partless self would have to be in that kind of central part of the brain, that control center. But that's not in accordance with our experience here, because if it was, well, first of all, as we previously talked about it, if the self was located in the heart, then the eye would be surrounded by lungs, by the upper part of the body, the head, then the stomach would be underneath it. So, but there's no sense that the self is surrounded by all these organs. If likewise the self were to be in the center of the brain, that'd be kind of a dirty, weird, disgusting place. It would be like in this wobbly kind of weird place. So again, it kind of seems weird that the self could be located, such a part of the self could be actually located in the brain. And moreover, when I have an itch in my leg, I couldn't be saying I'm itching, because the eye is actually located in the brain. It's got nothing to do with the leg. So therefore, there's more of a sense that the sense that the eye is pervasive and not partners are located in one place.
Do you know?
If you have any questions, you can ask them.
Let's go. Nga to ye siye ki chokche di ngawanya bilo diribesi.
Ngawanya bilo di Koran Ranguni yube nga nangero takaranzin belo imadamchido. Deona lo takarangi Ranguni yube nga zibelo ina. Ni de kanishobe gyonzendi tane de kunzop jokchegi rotan ini kunzop Koran de Ranguni tobor zimbelo de iwa de chema tobor da bichende. Shesande da deshichik tmona.
nga nyembi loji ta nga kazan keje shewa na shi nga ramuni chuwa yo ma ine nga yo re keje di shewa ro di ji du zane nga zui gi shewa de le ane nga zimbi lo di lo yang da ba lo tun tun tsema ane nga ramuni chuwa zimbi lo di ane chinji lo keje shewa ro jan di yo che du me dos nga ramuni chuwa zimbi lo da nga zimbi lo di yo che du di ro nga nyambi lo di da nga ramuni chuwa zimbi lo ni di iwa kanti che wo re
这个主要是在